Okay. Thanks, Edward. Thank you. Yeah, we'll just see. We've still got some people dribbling in. I think it's right. We're up against Connect More today. So we're kind of, but I was hoping we would kind of we were sufficiently different enough that we'd have lots of people. But hopefully, folks will continue to dribble in. But we are recording, and I think this will provide a useful resource to it's particularly our assistive technology community as well. Maybe want to kind of dip in later and continue the conversation. So, welcome. I recognize some names, but if you are new to these drop-ins, they are very friendly and informal, and we're so lucky today to have a group of really interesting people doing lots of different things. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing what people have to say today. I'm just going to hand over to my colleague Helen, who is our subject specialist for assistive technology and for AI at Jisc. Just to mention a little bit about just the background to this session and why we chose to do it.
Thanks, Kelly. Hi, everyone. I think I know quite a few people on the call as well today, which is really nice. So yeah, this event, it's really quite community driven and from the Assistive Technology Network as well. If you don't know the Assistive Technology Network, it is a community group supported by Jisc and Techability that really aims to provide a supportive space for assistive technology practitioners. That network has sort of a steering leadership group as well, with members from across the UK, and quite a few of those are on the call today as well, which is brilliant. Some of them are speaking too. And that group works together really to plan events and opportunities based on the needs and interests of the network's members. So among that group and in Jisc's accessibility team as well, we'd had quite a few conversations recently around interest in how to get started with research around assistive technology, or for people who've done some smaller projects, how to expand that existing research into something bigger, and how to look at avenues to publish as well. So of course we thought there's a lot of expertise within the AT network and with people that we've come to know as well. So this has just seemed like a really great opportunity to bring a few different speakers together with that range of experience, so we can hear from them and also have the opportunity, I think, to grill them a bit and ask them some questions about how to kind of further this field of AT research as well. I will say if the community sounds appealing to you, do join us. I think Piers has popped a link in the chat there. It's fantastic. We do have quite a lively Jisc mail group as well, where you can exchange ideas, exchange research as well, and ask questions on there. And that's open to everyone working in FE and HE. You certainly don't need to be an expert in this area to join as well. It's open to kind of all experience levels. So yeah, that's the origins, I suppose, of today. I know I'm really looking forward to it. I know some of these speakers, but I don't know some of the other ones. And I'm really interested to hear what they've got to share. So I'm just going to hand over, I think, actually to our first speaker, which is Piers, and they'll introduce themselves and their session.
Ahoy, everyone. Bear with me a second whilst I navigate sharing my screen. Hopefully this works. We did test it. Don't know why that appears all the way on my third screen, but is this displaying correctly for everyone? Hopefully it's all big and nicely in
Yes,
front of
looks
everyone's
good.
face.
Yes.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Hi everyone, I am Piers Wilkinson. I am a learning technologist now at the University of Southampton. However, I have had many hats throughout my time in our community. So some of you may know me as recently a commissioner for the Disabled Students Commission, heading up all things sort of inclusive technology within the commission, as well as student voice. As part of that, I also moonlight, I suppose, is the best way of phrasing it. I'm not a dedicated researcher per se, more as a moonlighting researcher on certain projects. around disability voice representation and assistive technology. And one of those things was recently published by the government's Cabinet Office Disability Unit before they moved it to being another department. They keep changing it, so I'm just going to say Cabinet Office Disability Unit, along with a couple of other papers have come out recently. So I thought I would do a very short, quick summary of some insights that have drawn uh, from these pieces of research, this qualitative research, into I'll get onto them in a second. Um, but importantly, what it means for us as researchers, as disabled researchers ourselves, those that aren't aware, I am or identify as a disabled person that uses assistive technology, everything from JAWS, which I have going off in my ear and hopefully not through my computer right now, along with a couple of other bits of software, but also as participants in the research that we do. AT users are overwhelmingly inherently disabled people more often than not. So today I wanted to sort of talk about rethinking assistive technology research, but what shapes connection when access isn't equal. And the reason why I've called it that sort of subtitle of what shapes connection is fundamentally what my first sort of paper looked at, which was disability relationships and loneliness. There was a lot of insights in this paper, and I highly recommend people go and look at it if you are interested after today's sort of flavor of the paper, as it were, because it looked at 158 source papers, which is quite a big thematic analysis for anyone that has had to sit through reading a whole bunch of papers and assessing them and analyzing them, and in particular looking specifically at the representation of disabled people and their relationships, how they're formed, how do they access them, and how do we work together, predominantly around social networks and all types of relationships, both platonic, romantic, and service-based. That service base is where I'm drawing a lot of the insights I'll talk about in a little moment. The second main goal was looking at the barriers and the impacts. A lot of that is going to be water is wet to everyone here. However, I think it bears reminding when we talk about assistive technology that it is people that is impacted more often than not. And we're not just numbers. And then lastly, the thing that we'll probably all want to know is looking at the improvements to schemes, designs, adaptations, and services. What can we do to do better? One of the things I do want to touch on is that this is going to come up in a second, but this paper was written by and investigated by predominantly disabled researchers. There was a theme of nothing about us without us throughout the entire work. In particular, one of the criteria for whether or not a paper was to be included in the overall thematic analysis was that they had the voices of the disabled people in the paper. So that meant that if the paper only included voices of parents, carers, or advocates, or lacked direct lived experience of the disabled people they were talking about, it was automatically excluded. So there was a lot of papers that we had to throw out from this scope because even though it talked about AT users or in the sort of the more wider sense, disabled people more generally, quite a few of them failed to actually include those disabled people as part of the qualitative analysis and instead investigated the people around them, which, when the paper is about the disabled people themselves, was an interesting find that we struggled with. And is something that I know from having spoken to some of you on the call has been something that you may have found in AT research as well. Ultimately, we found that overwhelmingly there's a lack of diversity within disability reflected in research. It's often very, very specific in terms of impairment type, so learning disability overwhelmingly represented, as well as certain types of spinal cord injury, stroke, and acquired disability is often investigated. But importantly, even in those, they're overwhelmingly investigated in institutional, clinical, and service-orientated settings. So not in the natural way in which someone would use AT in their everyday. yes, I use AT when I go to work, but that's only 6, 7 hours of my day. I use AT to shop. I use AT to socialize. I use my Dragon macros to play video games. Feel free to talk to me after this event about how I do that. But it's overwhelmingly we found the vast majority of papers l- source disabled participants from institutional settings, clinical and service orientated settings, as well as not having the intersectional aspect of it being medicalized versus being disability based. So, for example, um, if they are non-verbal or an AAC user, augmentative alternative communication, they were automatically excluded from all but two papers that we looked at because, as part of the research process, they just weren't able to find funding or support for the additional support needed to get qualitative experiences for those that are quote unquote non-verbal. I hate that phrase because just because someone communicates verbally in a different way that is non-traditional, as it were, does not mean they're non-verbal. It just means that they're communicating in a different way than you would assume. However, only two papers included non quote unquote non-verbal participants in their qualitative analysis. So it's both diversity in the natural sense, but also diversity within the subset is incredibly hampered when it comes to representation. Unsurprisingly, as I mentioned already, underrepresented as co-investigators and authors as well. Only 8% of the papers we looked at were specifically mentioning that they had disabled researchers as co-authors or co-investigators or co-researchers. So in terms of being part of the community, there is a need to centre disabled voices both within the qualitative analysis that we looked at, but also more generally across all research, particularly when we're talking about assistive technology users. Their voice kind of is important to how we conduct ourselves, as well as bringing people on board as co-investigators. I do just want to touch on something that's not quite AT specific, but is quite important for how we interact with people. And that is around the nuances of service and network boundaries. Overwhelmingly, AT requires AT training. It requires interacting with some sort of service, whether that's to get funding, whether that's to get assessed in the first place. And there is a reliance overwhelmingly on formal services and informal support networks to create, form, develop, and build relationships in the paper that we looked at. So, in the context of assistive technology, it was a critical factor into deciding whether or not a disabled individual had the ability to form relationships, to build networks, and importantly, to stave off isolation and loneliness. So, when we talk about AT and we talk about the research that we do, we have to remember the impact that this is a critical route that someone has to their entire life, both in terms of access, but also in terms of navigating when formal services suck, unfortunately. Um, that point, it limits relationship development. I'm not going to expand too much on that. It's what it says on the tin. If we don't get this right and we don't get the boundaries right, we don't get the technology right, or we don't deliver it in a way that recognizes how someone might want to use it in a way that better suits them, better suits their identity, in particular, if they're LGBT plus. We see a lot of services being delivered for disabled people that don't understand the nuance of being gay and disabled and how that might interact in how you use AT, what you use AT for, um, key words that you want your dictation software to recognize. For example, LGBT plus had to be hard coded into my Dragon so that it got it right when I was speaking about the community that I was a part of. So service redesign stuff, training needed on relational awareness. This is a quick minor nod towards people overstepping boundaries, but also not recognizing where those boundaries are. If you have an interpreter, if you have software that helps you, people have very weird ways of interacting and understanding where the lines are when it comes to interacting with others in terms of understanding what the boundaries are. So we need to be better aware as researchers what boundaries are, when we need to step in for when someone's being spoken on behalf of rather than interpreting, but also vice versa, helping someone to interpret better for the disabled person that they're supporting, particularly when it comes to capturing voice in qualitative research. And then familial networks fill gaps just because someone can't afford or doesn't have access to formal services that are interpreters doesn't mean that their family filling in for them is not also a critical way of engaging with research. And then finally, in the last sort of 4 or 5 minutes before we get into questions, I wanted to touch on the aspect that I am quite interested in, which is career progress of disabled researchers. As a disabled researcher, I have always been interested in how we are represented in the sector, particularly because we're overwhelmingly underrepresented in terms of total authorship. So, colleagues of mine at LSBU, in partnership with some partners who I've forgotten and don't have in my notes, so I will give the link later, looked into how the COVID pandemic affected the career progress of disabled researchers who are also minoritized by race, gender, and caring responsibilities, also published this year. So, frequent research, relevant research. And the aim was to try and identify some key predictors around the career progress of those that are marginalised by disability as well as race or gender or caring responsibilities in the UK due to the COVID pandemic. It was quite an expansive qualitative piece of research that looked at having focus groups, online survey, and one-to-one interviews. Given the level of specificity in terms of those that are minoritized by two characteristics, in this case, disability and one of the others, 128 researchers from institutions across the UK is actually quite a good turnout in terms of engagement with the research. And this is going to be water as wet, unfortunately. Greater perceived support, institutional support predicted having a greater sense of career progress. Who knew the institution that employs you, supporting you properly as a disabled researcher with another minoritized characteristic, you have a greater sense of your career being better than it is than where it might be otherwise. A mixture of internal and external mentors can advance career rank and publications. Kind of a water as wet, but it's really important that we get mentorship, menteeship as researchers, how to improve assistive technology research. Let's start mentoring each other a bit more, making sure that we have a diverse range of mentors and mentees. Career progress linked with types of employment contracts and choosing a research career for stability. Unsurprisingly, if you're in a fixed term contract with precarity in terms of your employment status, you're not going to think that your career is going overly well. And then similarly, those that those that chose research as a career for its stability overwhelmingly felt that they were very advanced in their careers. So we have this sort of dynamic in the population that was surveyed of those that are doing well and feel like their career is going well, feel like they have stability and chose the career because of stability. Those that feel like their career isn't going well are overwhelmingly also those that feel like their type of employment contract doesn't reassure them, doesn't make them feel safe in the field, as it were. And that might be something that could be further looked into when we talk about disabled researchers. And finally, training and teaching scientific and grant writing boosts self-efficacy. Water is wet, but we have it in research now. Unsurprisingly, if we train up newer researchers, returning researchers, particularly those returning from maternity leave, paternity leave, and other related health leave, importantly, knowing how to write a good grant application, knowing how to write a good research paper, particularly when criteria change overnight because the publisher decided to change it all on a whim. That's a personal gripe that I have with a particular publisher, but we'll leave that for another day. But also training and teaching. You know, researchers are overwhelmingly being asked to do more than just research. Research fellows are also being asked to be fill-in teachers, fill-in TAs as the sector shrinks a little bit, unfortunately, in the times that we are in. So one of the things that came out was uh, help help each other to help ourselves. And that's all I got time for 15 minutes. And leaving it to Q&A. Woohoo!
Thanks, Piers. That was great. That's fantastic. Yeah, if folks have got questions for Piers, please do pop them in the chat or grab the mic. Um, Talking of Mike, Mike's popped a question in the chat. Well, not a question, but a statement I think we can maybe turn into a question. That professional services, for instance, disability services, learning technologists, aren't typically supported by institutions to undertake research. So I guess if we turn that into a question, how might we support people? I mean, I suppose this is broader than just your question. Oh, Mike's got a hand up. Do you want to elaborate on your question, on your statement slash
Yeah,
question?
yeah. Hi, Piers. Great. It's Mike Wald here. Great that you've joined us at Southampton. Yeah, I mean, I set up many, many years ago a Centre for Enabling Learning Technologies to do assessments for disabled students. And one of the ideas of it was the funding and would support research into assistive technologies to help our students. And the university's attitude was if it's a service, it doesn't do research. Academics do research, service staff do services. They're not researchers. And it's quite difficult, I found, to get any crossing of the two. It was also really difficult to do research with students. Obviously, there's issues of confidentiality and consent. Um, but to me, having disabled students, having assistive technology centre, having research, the whole thing should have worked together. But there was no support from the university really for that.
It's interesting you mentioned that because that is something that I have a bit of a bugbear also with, that traditionally professional services are going from one project to another immediately as quickly as possible to because of just the work commitments on professional services to do the next thing. Um, but we're also being asked to produce these amazing data sets, but not do anything with them. Within my first couple of months here at Southampton, don't get me wrong, I love my job at Southampton. In terms of the community that I've joined, and the people here are fantastic in terms of supporting me in the work that I'm doing. But there are so many data sets that I'm just like, this could be an incredibly insightful bit of research if we just had a month to just sit down and go, right, we've got data on this, we've got insights. Christ, as a learning technologist that's worked on our Ultra project, we've got amazing amount of insight into how our students are engaging with their virtual learning environment, and importantly, where they're struggling with it. But having the time as a professional service member to go, right, we finished this project. We're now going to take a month and a half to actually research, review, work with our academic researchers, work with our colleagues in the departments that we've been supporting to review and co-publish or co-author something around the insights that we've gotten from the course that they've run and the changes that we've worked together on. I think is something that is really easy to put in place. But as you say, there's this reluctance to have professional services involved in research because researchers require PhDs and this, that, and the other. And I look around my digital learning room and everyone's a doctor apart from me, it feels like at times. So I think there needs to be a bit of a cultural shift in who does research nowadays. And it's not just your academic who has done 4 PhDs in a subject. They still do research, of course. But I think the vast majority of researchers are people that moonlight, are people that are on fixed term contracts, are people that are co-authoring with partners from other institutions. So thank you for raising that point. It's such an underused area of expertise. Um, but importantly, easy, free-ish data we have just sitting there that's not having anything done with it, which is really, really weird to me. It's loss of so much potential.
That's great, thanks. So we've got a comment as well from Ursula who's saying that she got something published in NADP, which is the National Association of Disability Practitioners, I want to say.
Yeah.
Their journal by telling my manager after I did it. But I think interesting point there that you used advice from an academic colleague who helped with pulling things together in an
As a
academic manner. So there's
director of
different ways of doing
NADP,
things.
can I just say we have a call for papers open right now. It's so funny you mentioned NADP and research. Feel free to suggest a paper if you so desire. We'll happily publish your research if it's good, of course. We have standards. We're a journal, but we've got to call for papers out.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, guys. Okay, so this is just a quickie. Now, the purpose of this is that, as Helen mentioned earlier, we started the idea of this with really some folks getting in touch with us, saying they were interested to explore research in different ways around assistive tech, but also folks who have perhaps done quite a lot of work for maybe a master's program, maybe different disciplines, because as I think Rowan's going to touch on later, the thing with assistive tech is that it can sit in different disciplines. But they've done all this work, often with a bit of a research focus, and well, what can I do with that? Could it become something kind of publishable? Could I, punt it to a journal? And so what I was just going to take a few minutes to talk about is this is something that I did. So I'm just going to share how I did it. Oh, thanks, Piers. That's great. Sorry, I spelled that. So, from dissertation to publication. Now, and I should say as well, this is just my experience from also working within my discipline as well. But it might give you a bit of an idea or inspiration of things to look at. Maybe demystify what happens. So, okay, so just to give a little bit of overview. So, the dissertation that I wrote was for a master's, and it was at Edinburgh University. And I completed that in 2020. And the master's was within the School of Psychology. So it was children and young people's mental health and psychological practice. Now you can see here, this is on the screen there. I've got a little screenshot of the final published journal item, which was in health policy and technology. And something I just want to highlight there is how long that took. And especially when we're talking about technology as well, often time is of the essence. But we weren't slacking that much, but it still took over 2 years from when I completed my dissertation to actually it being published. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why that is and how that happened. Also, you might notice as well on this little screenshot thing is typically authors are listed alphabetically, but you'll see there we're not actually. Willis is in front of me, and I'll explain why that is as well. And it's absolutely fine because it wouldn't have happened without him. So I'm absolutely fine for him to go first. But yeah, I'll just talk a bit about how this happened and why it takes so bleeding long as well. I'll be interested to hear from our other presenters as well, who've published about how long things take. So from the outset, I would say what was extremely useful was that I had a supervisor, which was the aforementioned Vilas Sarikar, who's from a clinical psychology background. So a lot of a large component of the course that I did was there was actually quite a lot of emphasis about writing for publication, and about that was the kind of standard that they were looking for. So in quite a few of the courses and modules, there was a lot about scientific writing and things around ethics and things around statistics. And what makes a good journal article and what doesn't. So we were kind of being a bit primed for that anyway, I would say. We did have a bit of an advantage there. Also because the topic lent itself to quite a broad range of psychology, from developmental through to clinical, it meant there was a lot of supervisors, and they were also very cognizant of how long it can take for ethics to get approved in the field of developmental and clinical psychology, just because of the nature of the topic as well. So they had actually all done quite a bit of groundwork in terms of being very upfront. We were all given a directory saying these are the supervisors, these are the things they are interested to supervise. So it was very much tailored towards how fast are we going to get this through. Oh, interesting. Piers had a 2-year turnaround as well. It was very much geared towards we need to get this through ethics, and we're quite confident that this subject will get us through. And also there were topics that the supervisors themselves were interested in publishing on. So kind of had a bit of a head start there. So ethics themselves did take a good few months, but we got that through. What we were also looking at as well is ensuring that we had a good sample size and power analysis, which I think it depends on what kind of paper you're doing, but if you're doing something that's more, say, like an individual case study or something very specialist with a small number of students, that's that's kind of different kettle of fish. Typically, particularly in the world of psychology, you're looking for large sample sizes where you can have that gives you better power, which just means you can be more confident that your results are indicating a particular pattern, and that they can be generalizable to the wider population. So yeah, we were also looking for as well as getting some good, robust statistical findings and something a bit interesting as well. Because you also need, if you're looking to get published as well, you need to be quite confident that you're talking about something that's quite new, that you're adding something to the body of knowledge that is out there. That's what's going to be interesting. So we then needed to identify the right kind of journal, look at things, and this is something you can look up in your own time, is looking at things like the impact factor of a journal. The higher the impact number, it just means the more high quality journal it is. The impact rating is calculated from typically the number of citations that a journal is getting. So you'll find the more well-known, once you start getting into kind of Lancet and things like this, the impact factor starts to rocket up. So you want to get as good as you can. Really check the submission guidelines. You have to adhere to them very, very accurately if you want to be considered at all. Think about your writing style as well, having a good, clear writing style. Your journal submission will be a lot shorter than your dissertation and be maybe have some of the same content, but be a lot more succinct. A tip that I got the other day from speaking to an editor was what they're looking for is the first thing they look at is the abstract and then the conclusion, and then they go back and read through it. That might just be that one guy, but that's how he said he did it. Abstracts generally are a great way to capture people's attention, and it helps people when they're researching. You also need to include enough information about what you did to ensure that someone else could replicate your study and see if they get the same results. Boop. So this is very whistle-stop tour, and I'll pop a link to the actual final article in case it's of any interest to people in the chat once I've finished. But the top tips are, if you're looking to do this, the first thing I'd say is really read the journals that you're interested in submitting to. Look at the style, look at the kinds of things they're writing about, get a sense of the kinds of things that get accepted for publication, because you can be sure for everything that's actually in a journal, behind that, there's hundreds and hundreds of other articles that didn't make the cut. So have a look at what is making the cut. And be aware as well as that the higher impact a journal is, the stricter, the more competition there's going to be as well. So really clear writing, be patient, as I thought it was interesting Piers mentioning there as well. Yep, it can take absolutely ages for a turnaround, which in the world of technology feels a bit kind of like, oh no, things might have moved on. But it can be a long process. You can have a lot of back and forths with reviewers. So accept their feedback, even if they reject you, take that feedback on board, because that will be useful in getting accepted somewhere else. And another thing is just a kind of courtesy thing as well, is it's best not to, it's considered kind of quite bad form to submit to a number of journals simultaneously and see if one of them takes you. You should really, the kind of professional understanding is that you should submit to one journal at a time. Because if you are hedging your bets and say two accept you, to say to one of them, oh, actually, I'm not going with you, I've had a better offer, doesn't go down fantastically because they've spent a lot of time reviewing your article. So that's the other thing to note. So I wasn't timing myself there, but I was hoping that was nice and short. I will stop sharing and I'll have a little look. Yeah. Oh, that's an interesting thing that Arthur's mentioned there about applying for course level ethics approval, so you don't need to wait months. Yeah, nice one. That would be interesting. Yeah, and Rowan's saying as well, yeah, you would be quite cheesed off. Yeah, but a quick thing about open access fees. So I'll mention this while Sonia, if you want to get started up. Yeah, that was so this is something I learned about from the other side, is that we're all loving open access journals, but they do actually often charge, and sometimes, if I recall, it's a while ago, but yeah, they do. They can charge. It can be a few £1,000, I think, as much as that to submit to an open access journal. Um, so we didn't go down the open access route, although my article is available to everybody. So here we go. Sonia, are you okay? Are you all right with?
Yes, I'll just share my screen and
Yeah.
then start.
We can. Oh,
Yeah.
that's a nice shout out for Jisc there from Arthur, that Jisc covers open access fees for many universities. Um, yeah, there's some good chat there. Okay, right. I am going to shut up and I'll keep an eye on the chat. But Sonia, if you'd like to take it away, I think we're really interested to hear what you are up to with your current research.
Yes. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Sonia. I'm a first year PhD researcher here at the University of Cambridge, and I'm really happy to be sort of giving a brief talk on the research that we do here in Cambridge and the research that I'm doing personally as well. So thank you, Kelly, for inviting me to be part of this discussion. All right, so maybe I can jump straight into it then. So my today's topic will be around human-centered technologies to support neuro-inclusive learning and human flourishing. I can introduce a bit about my background and also the research centers here in Cambridge that are interested in this topic. So yeah, if you can't recognize from my name or from my accent, I'm from Finland. So that's where I completed my both bachelor's and master's degrees in. They were both in computer science, and I just moved to Cambridge this October. And I'm being supervised by Professor Jenny Gibson. And so currently I'm affiliated with two research centers. First one is the Play and Communication Lab, and it's based in the Faculty of Education. And we focus on neurodiversity, and we take a neurodiversity affirming approach. So instead of trying to instead of viewing neurodivergence as deficits or trying to impose any normative standards or behaviors, we sort of appreciate the natural variations that we have as humans and try to build on the natural strengths and interests, for instance. And the second center that I'm part of is the CHIA Center so it's the Center for Human Inspired AI, and it's a quite new interdisciplinary research center. We have several different research tracks. There's, for instance, AI for creativity, AI for cognition, AI for education, so on and so forth. But essentially, what sort of unites us is the underlying notion that AI needs to be better equipped with understanding the human intelligence, values, and also and make AI really human-centered and inclusive as well. And yeah, also our labs, so the play and communication lab, we collaborate quite a lot, and it's a very interdisciplinary lab. So recently we've been collaborating with robotists. And actually you might see from the picture on the bottom of the graph on the slide, there's a picture of a recent project that was just finished. We examined how social robots, so robots that interact with humans, how they can help students with disabilities in higher education. Yeah, so my current research is I'll be looking at how AI and robots can help neurodivergent primary school learners in not only in their learning and teaching, but also in their development as well. As we know, children are developing and constantly evolving, so we need to account that aspect as well as with assistive technologies. And then I can talk a bit about the background as well for those if I'm sure quite many of you are familiar with the term of neurodiversity, but I might just do a quick recap on the importance of it. So neurodiversity is a relatively new paradigm, and it's an umbrella term that recognizes neurological differences as natural variations. So rather than viewing them as deficits, we recognize it as sorts of natural forms of biodiversity in one sense. And we're not talking about a too small population, and actually 15 to 20%, so 1 in 5 people of the global population is actually neurodivergent. And I think also what is interesting that at the same time, in addition to the new neurodiversity paradigm, there's increasing numbers in the identification of neurodivergent children. So I've included here an example stats, which now is focused on autistic children, but actually autistic children, the identification has increased by over 300% in the United States since the year 2000. So given these sort of two trends, which is firstly the paradigm itself, but also the increasing numbers in children being neurodivergent, traditional education systems now face more pressure in supporting the diverse learner populations. And they have been criticized for not being able to support neurodivergent children as well as they could have, but it's not the fault of teachers, but maybe more structural, lack of resources, etc. But regardless of the underlying reasons, we think that AI and robotics are quite powerful, and if done researched in a human-centered manner, they could offer new, exciting opportunities to support meaningful and personalized help for neurodivergent children. Currently, we're working on a paper at the moment. So we know that there's an increasing use of educational technologies being integrated for neurodivergent learners. So this includes AI tools, but also various other technologies. So for instance, virtual realities, different assistants, and so forth. But then at the same time, it is a bit unclear how these different tools actually meaningfully accommodate the diverse learner needs. So it's a bit unsure because many of the tools, they pose themselves as being really beneficial and helpful, but it's slightly unclear on a concrete level in what ways they actually support the diverse needs. So we're interested to take a look in that sense. But then furthermore, not only is the sort of the design aspects a bit unclear, but also how these tools are being then integrated into actual teaching practices is a bit sort of fragmented as well. So the review aims to sort of take a sort of two-directional step, like a broader stance, combining two perspectives. So we're looking at how these tools support neurodivergent learners from the design level, but also how these tools then are being integrated into educational practices. Because there's these tools, the effectiveness doesn't stop in the design phase, but also in their actual practice and the impact that they have. Yeah, Thank you. Wonderful to have you, like wonderful for you to take your time and listen to my talk. I'd be curious to hear any of your feedback and questions. But then equally, I have prepared actually two questions and would be happy to hear your thoughts on it. So the first question is if anyone knows of someone who has worked in the past or who is working currently with primary school children and technology. That's the first question. If you do, please connect with me, and then we could have a chat about it later. But then secondly, I'd like to hear your thoughts on the evaluation or the effectiveness of educational or assistive technologies. Because we know that they are being increasingly researched and claimed to be effective, but then I'm wondering if anyone knows of any existing evaluative frameworks or measurements or assessment metrics that have been used either with children or adults in this educational context. Thank you.
Thanks, that's great. Thank you, Sonja. People can, please do feel free to use the chat if you want to respond to Sonia, if you need to sort of think about that, or I see Mike's got
Yeah.
his hand up. We can, and what we can do is while we're sort of changing over, we're okay timing wise. We've still got plenty of time despite all our ups and downs today. But while people change over, Mike, do you want to ask a question?
Well, no, I was just going to make a comment. I mean, I've worked in schools with disabled kids of all sorts, with technology, with robotics and everything. I think one of the problems of evaluating any use of technology with children is you can't forget the teacher.
Mm.
The idea of replicating things. For example, when logo was invented by Seymour Papert, there was a way of doing it, and then people turned it into something that into a curriculum with worksheets, which was against the whole way of using it. So I think one of the problems of evaluating any technology with children is, the human in the loop is so important. And I don't know how you can evaluate it, just the technology and not the interaction and how the teacher interacts with the children.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. So that's one of the motivations for the sort of for the question as well, because from what I've explored around the topic, there's not that much being done on it. And especially even if they have done any evaluative frameworks, it's very much focused on the technical aspect, but then ignoring the actual, for instance, the classroom or teacher practice. So that's a very good point. Thank you. Yeah. Are there any other comments? Is anyone currently working with primary school children or knows of someone who is currently working?
I do. Know someone, not me. I refuse to work with kids that can hurt their fingers on my wheelchair. Uh, it's it's a fear of mine that I have spinny wheels, and kids love spinny wheels. Um, I know what I was going to say is two things. The first one is to answer that quick question. I highly recommend reaching out. Rowan, one, I 100% think if you haven't spoken with Rowan yet, please do speak with Rowan. I think at least passing on the context at DFE for those discussing AT there might be useful because a colleague of mine who I used to work with who now works at the Department for Education is the one that oversees the national curriculum stuff. So I don't know if they're covered by primary school or if it's maybe slightly above the age, but I can look into it for you. Um, the because they look at that, and then the other aspect I was going to say was, have you had many conversations about university courses, potentially at Cambridge even, but I know there's a couple of others of the sh courses that have students who are on placements in primary schools. So the people that are learning to be the next teachers, um, because the reason why I mentioned it is I recently did a project with Nordland University, which is a private American university for the really, really fancy nannies. But it was around accessibility and examinations, and it was really fascinating talking to the staff there because they were intrinsically linked with their courses with placements. So we were able to talk to the staff who are teaching and get their insight into the future of young primary care, because obviously they're nannies, so they do a little bit of teaching. But also the students and getting their insights into what they think would be better, what would be more useful in terms of resources for upskilling around inclusive technology and assessment technology. Specifically, then we were looking at assessments and inclusive practice around the use of technology in assessments and such forth. So not quite the same, but yeah, I thought I'd mention those two things. And then my question, sorry, is do you have you encountered much formalization or difficulty accessing like local authority information around? Because obviously local authorities control effectively who gets support in schools via the EHCP nonsense. Um, I'm sorry, the very vaunted assessment process that is the EHCP program that doesn't isn't a national lottery depending on where you live. But I don't know if you wanted if you'd encountered that wonderful system.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard about the system, but I haven't been in touch with them yet. So I'm 2 months into my PhD, so I
Okay.
might need to be in touch with them later on. So we'll see. Yeah. But thank you. Maybe I could like send you an email afterwards to discuss a bit more. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Sonia. Thanks. That was fantastic. And next we have Arthur. And just to reassure people as well, because I was a bit freaked out today by how low our numbers were, but it does seem that we seem to be plagued today. We've had Zoom hassle, but I think I've just discovered a lot of people went to a accidentally duplicated Teams meeting for this. But I've sent them a message and said we're recording. So we do have lots of people interested in assistive tech. And we're okay for time, Arthur and Rowan as well, because we hand over to Arthur and Edward and I will see what we can do. Okay, just go for it, Arthur.
Yeah, sure. I'll try to stay within 10 minutes. I hope my slides are showing okay.
Yes, they look great. Thank you.
Oh, perfect. Great. So yeah, thanks for inviting me for this session. It has been very informative so far. So I'm Arthur Tile. I'm a senior lecturer in human-computer interaction at Birmingham City University. I'm part of the Department of Computer Science, and I'll be contributing with this discussion with some of my research with the deafblind community, and also talk about a little bit of conducting research with people with multiple disabilities, which is an underexplored research area. So before I talk about some of the projects I have been working on, I just wanted to talk a little bit about me and my work. So here at BCU, I'm part of the Human-Computer Interaction Research Center, where I supervise PhD students working in accessibility and inclusive design. I also teach undergraduate and graduate students around topics of UX, accessibility, and inclusive technology in general. I also lead the research cluster on accessibility and assistive technology. We have a number of academics here at BCU interested in doing research around accessibility with different uh, disabled communities in different areas. We do have a very strong participatory approach in our research. We also align very well with the social model of disability. We think accessibility barriers are built by society, not by individuals. And we try to embed this framework in our research. I can also share the link to our research group if you're interested to know more about our group members and our research. But basically, I sit within the computer science department at the HCI group. I also wanted to do a little bit of self promotion. I am one of the co organizers of the ACM Europe Summer School on accessible and inclusive technologies. Um, Last year, we had the first summer school hosted here at BCU in Birmingham. This year, we had the second one hosted in Sweden. And next year, it will be Italy. So this summer school is focused on PhD students, researchers, practitioners interested in research around accessibility. So if you are interested, hopefully we can share more information very soon. Um, so fingers crossed, everything goes well. So yeah, if you're interested, it's a very nice community to talk about research, hear about speakers, academics doing excellent research in this area. So the focus of my talk is around assistive tech research and individuals with multiple disabilities, which again is a very underexplored area. And we know that the disabled experience is sometimes very complex. So I wanted to highlight this literature review paper that came out a few years ago by Kelly Mack and her colleagues, where they surveyed over 800 accessibility and AT papers published at CHI and ASITS, which are two big conferences in our field. And they found in this literature review that over 40% of the papers in the past 10 years focused on accessibility research for blind and low vision people. So this is the kind of the hot topic in the accessibility research community. And also they found that only 7.1% of all the papers published in this area focus on assistive tech and individuals with multiple disabilities who experience two or more disabilities or impairments. So there's a huge gap in terms of research, and there's an urgent need of conducting more research with these communities, which aligns well with some of my recent work. So because of time, I'm going to just introduce two projects that I think are relevant in this area. So the first project I wanted to share today, it finishes a few years ago. It was funded by the EU. It's called Suitcase, and the focus of the project was around developing smart haptic technologies for deafblind people. But the specific area I was working on was around accessible games and deafblind gamers. And as part of this research, we were the first to actually interview deafblind gamers across 6 European countries, and to try to understand their personal experiences with gaming, accessibility challenges they face, and also try to come up with some game accessibility guidelines that would take into consideration the experiences of people, gamers living with multiple disabilities. So, for those who are not familiar with what deafblindness is, it's basically when someone experiences the combination of both hearing and visual impairment. And this research has been published, so it's fully available for anyone who's interested. But one thing that we found is that by conducting research with deafblind people, we found that games are not accessible. And one of the reasons why games are not accessible for this community was because it doesn't take into consideration gamers who need to use multiple assistive technologies, multiple assistive devices at the same time, which is the case for quite a few deafblind individuals. They might have to combine, for example, a cochlear implant with a screen reader or a refreshable braille display with captions. And basically, even though games are becoming more and more accessible, this was not there yet. I also wanted to share another project, more recent. These results have not been published yet, but I wanted to share today because I think it's relevant. Which was funded by the UK Fin Network and EPSRC. So it's around co-creating inclusive financial technologies with disabled communities, in particular deafblind people. So as part of this project, we conducted 28 interviews with deafblind individuals across the UK to understand their experiences with financial technologies, personal banking, any accessibility challenges they face with these technologies. And again, similar to our previous project, even though the technology area is completely different, we found that there are so many um, accessibility challenges related to using multiple assistive technologies at the same time to access information, to access different answers. One thing that was mentioned as part of this project was around security concerns regarding assistive technology use, especially in public. So, for example, if you are a deafblind person and you want to check your bank account, uh, in public or when you are in a public transportation, and you have to use a screen reader or braille display or any other type of assistive technology, there were so many security and privacy concerns related to that most banks don't understand because again, this is such an underexplored area that deafblind people were never part of research projects and never involved in research related to accessibility. So we are planning to publish these findings in full very soon, but we also have conducted accessibility research with other disabled communities regarding the co-creating inclusive financial technologies. But because this session is actually tailored for people who maybe are starting their career, their research, I wanted to highlight some of the challenges I face when I conduct accessibility research
Good.
with people with multiple disabilities.
Sorry.
Oh, no worries. So again, because I think this session is tailored for people who might be starting their research journey, I just wanted to highlight some of the challenges I faced when conducting research, accessibility research with these communities. So the first challenge that I've noticed as a researcher working with people and individuals with multiple disabilities or complex accessibility needs is the lack of standards related to terminology and research methods. Um, the way people talk about disabled people and the way people talk about accessibility and user needs is very different in different fields, and this is it creates additional barriers, for example, to doing literature reviews and to actually finding the latest research, which is very important for us as researchers. Um, Even simple things like person first language, disability first language, um, these can impact your ability as a researcher to find relevant papers for your research, and also challenges or lack of standards around research methods. The way we actually conduct our research. As a researcher, when I try to publish my work with deafblind people in the past, I have received comments from reviewers saying that, well, you didn't include enough people in your research. You need a larger sample size. But actually, this is very challenging for us as researchers trying to recruit enough participants. And also, the deafblind community is so diverse. Deafblind people have different needs and different preferences in terms of assistive technology. It doesn't make sense to try to generalize our results. So this lack of standards as a field of research or multiple fields of research is definitely a barrier to conducting effective research in this area. Um, as I briefly mentioned before, the complexity and the plurality of user needs, requirements, and experiences can also be a challenge to conducting research and coming to findings and key takeaways. Um, One thing that people have been in the accessibility field have been exploring recently is around bespoke solutions. So instead of trying to find solutions that work for a lot of people, people have been exploring bespoke solutions and co-creating personalized assistive tech with these individuals and communities, which is a growing practice in the research field. And finally, some challenges around limited resources. For example, in terms of communication, communicating with your research participants. If you are working with deaf-blind people, maybe they will need sign language interpreters or tactile sign language interpreters, and these cost money. And if your resources are limited, this will create barriers. Expertise as well. As researchers, we won't be experts in every single disability or every single context of use. So the learning curve should be considered as well. And funding available, it's very limited for accessibility research in general, but specifically for conducting research with individuals and communities with multiple disabilities. We have been publishing a lot about this topic. We have been organizing different workshops to discuss, how to move forward and how to create change in this area. And I'd love to hear about your thoughts and if any practices, any good practices around involving people with multiple disabilities or complex needs. Um, in your research practice. But I think my time is limited and I want to hear from Rowan. So thank you very much. If you want to connect on LinkedIn or email, I'm happy to talk more. Thank you.
Thanks, Arthur, and thank you so much for your your resilience there, dealing with our changeover. Yes, I think it's very apt that we have our final comments from Rowan, who just as well doesn't have slides to share and is going to freestyle. So we've been chatting along the way. So Rowan, take it away. Give us your words of wisdom.
Thanks, Kelly. There are three things I was hoping to talk about today. The first of which was really, well, sorry, let me introduce myself. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Dundee. I teach and lead the MSc in Educational Assistive Technology. So this is the program that myself and my colleagues run at the University of Dundee. So as far as we know, and I think we probably would know, this is the only MSc that focuses on electronic assistive technology in the UK, if not further afield, really. So we have an allied research program around assistive technology at the University of Dundee, and Dundee's had a long history of researching assistive technology and notably AAC, or alternative augmentative communication. So that's tech for people who don't have a natural voice. Similarly to Birmingham City University, Dundee has a big focus on including disabled people's experiences wherever possible. And we have a user centre at the university that runs or facilitates currently 3 user groups who participate in teaching and research across the university. So what that means is when medics are learning about, say, how to work with people with additional support requirements or alternative communication methods, then they learn that from people who use those alternative communication methods. So the first thing, excuse me, that I was hoping to talk about is that as assistive technology researchers, we often find that when we're applying for grant funding for AT-based projects, that this can be quite difficult. One of the reasons for that is that when we're applying for, say, a UKRI funded project from one of the research councils, we're consuming the limited word count available to us, explaining why assistive technology is important, and also explaining why this particular aspect of the research is important. In other fields, that's not really needed to the same extent. So my question really is this something that those present have found to be difficult? That you spend a lot of your allowed word count explaining to, say, a lay audience or someone who is not an assistive technology specialist why it's important. So have those present found that difficult? And if so, how have you overcome it? So is that a question anybody could comment on?
I can make a general comment. The problem I found is the difference between doing a, putting in a proposal that's not in response to a call. Is that what you're talking about? Just uh, you just put in a proposal and there hasn't been a call.
So an open call from one of the general research council
Yeah,
open
yeah,
calls. Yes,
yeah.
that's part of what I'm talking about. There
Is
aren't
the,
that many assistive technology specific calls that are out there.
no, so the problem I found is going for general calls where you're putting in something that's supporting people with disabilities. In other words, the call hasn't excluded it, so I put it in and I get back, oh, this it doesn't fit the call. Or that was a lovely proposal, but it's out of scope. Um, and that, even though, you know, they talk about inclusiveness in the research councils, all they're talking about is the researchers, having a wide range of diverse, male, female, whatever. But the actual work you do, and I find the reviewers also, when I go back to them and say, hold on, you haven't got any reviewers, you understood this, and so I find that's the problem as well.
Yes, so you wind up burning all your word count, explaining why it's important rather than really fleshing out your project idea. Piers, did you want to come in?
First and foremost, yeah, I've had that experience. But the way I've gotten around it is unfortunately lie. Uh, but in particular, I found most success with government-funded calls for research rather than the not well, they're technically charities, but you know what I mean, like UKRI type calls. I really struggle with getting any funding approved whatsoever. Like even when it's very, very, very specific and totally related to the call for evidence, and it's a mind boggle why it didn't get funded, particularly when you see what does get funded afterwards. But I've had real good success with things like the Office for Students or the Department for Education funding things. Um, but even then, kind of lying about the fact that the focus is on assistive technology and instead talking about the sort of the wishy-washy aspects, more sociology aspects. Apologies to sociologists, but then eventually still doing the research on assistive technology, if that makes sense.
Doing
So
it by the back
getting it,
door.
yeah, and then it's only afterwards that you're like, uh, uh, the overwhelming insights are about assistive technology and the sort of the people aspect. So doing it by the back door, I found a much more success than trying to explain why it's important to have interdisciplinary focus on assistive technology in this specific circumstance. So, for example, the thing I was talking earlier about assessments and inclusive practice, that was entirely funded about assessments. And I was just like, well, we can't talk about assessments in this day and age without talking about assistive technology use in assessment. So we ended up, going and looking at tools to support inclusive assessment practice in higher education and those sorts of things. So yeah, backdoor was the only success I've had.
So one of the things that we've been working on between my university, the Open University, and Bournemouth University is to set up a UK research network under the UKRI research network funding. And part of the purpose of that is to support UKRI research councils to understand why they should commission assistive technology specific research calls that are actually asking for it. So that's what we're trying to do to move that around. Kelly, is it okay if I move quickly on to one of the other themes I was hoping to cover,
Yes,
which is
please do. Yeah, I was just typing a little message to say I know some people might need to disappear, but if you don't, I'm happy to stay on and keep things going because I know we've had disruption. So um
fair
I
enough?
want to hear what you have to say, Rowan,
Okay,
even though it's just me and you.
I'll keep going, Kelly. So there are some important points I think to make around the issue of disciplinarity in AT research. This is because assistive tech research happens in a number of different disciplinary silos, or what become silos anyway. So some work gets done within computing, within particularly human-computer interaction. Some work is getting done within education, some within health, some in psychology, social work even. All of these areas mean that the searching the AT corpus of work can be difficult, particularly for students or for people that are less familiar. But what also happens is that researchers may not be particularly aware of some of the previous work that's happened, and that may have a bearing on what they're planning to do. There is a certain amount of wheel reinvention that tends to go on in assistive technology work, where people begin working on things that have already been addressed or have already been looked into and stopped for various reasons. And the thing that keeps happening is that we wind up with disabled people not being involved in assistive tech research, which means that suboptimum solutions could be produced. And this is bringing us back to the disability dongle idea, where things get created which were a good idea for a researcher, but really weren't something that disabled people were that bothered about. So involving disabled people from the off combats that. So really my question is, I'd be interested to hear from the group about how they're searching for previous AT work and if disciplinary barriers have been a problem that they've encountered when either designing new AT research or at least reviewing existing research. So what do people think?
I think one of the problems is research methodologies. Um, every discipline has its own research methodology. And for example, a computer scientist will look at a paper, perhaps in a social science journal, and decide to ignore the work because it doesn't fit the criteria um, for a computer science research methodology. And this particularly applies to things like PhDs. I'd be interested in Sonia's view on this. Um, we started in Southampton a web science um, PhDs and degrees, and it was cross-discipline, and it had to have supervisors from more than one discipline. But in the end, because there was no web science um, research methodology, and as a PhD student, you have to understand and quote, accepted discipline research methodologies. You ended up having to pick the first supervisor's area, and if it was sociology and computer science, the research methodologies are so different, it becomes a problem.
So I would regard the best assistive technology work as being, if not interdisciplinary, then possibly even transdisciplinary, because we need people from computing backgrounds, from education backgrounds, from health and therapy backgrounds to really do the best assistive tech work.
But the problem then is if you then send it to a journal, and this goes back to Kelly's area, the reviewers of that journal, will expect you to be following their discipline and their research methods, and they'll ask you all about their stuff. And if it's cross-disciplinary, you have a real problem with the reviewers getting it published.
So there are journals, I think, where that's less of an issue, like JET, Journal of Enabling Technologies, and also say the Resna Journal, also the AAC Journal as well. They tend to have reviewers drawn from computing, from allied health professions, and from education, which I think is helpful in the type of work we're aiming to do. So it may restrict where we can publish, but I think that's how we would address it.
Yeah, I could also add my thoughts on it. So I've also noticed a quite similar pattern. Although the team that I'm currently working here in Cambridge. It's very interdisciplinary. So I have a computer science background. We're in the Faculty of Education. Then we're with the AI Center, and my supervisor is a professor in developmental psychology. So it's very interdisciplinary, and which I do appreciate a lot. But when I'm reading the existing literature, I do find it's very segregated. So either it's the computer scientists working on their design features or evaluations and then completely ignoring the educational aspects, for instance, the pedagogical side, or then it's the other way around. So yeah, I'm not really sure. I think that there's quite a big um, sort of a silos, quite significant silos, but then not just within the research in neurodiversity. I feel like a lot of the assistive technologies, for instance, with people with disabilities or neurodiversity, there's a lot of different shared themes. So there's a lot of potential for collaboration and sort of building on top of each other's research, but it seems to be very sort of independently worked, even in that like regard as well. So yeah, that's my experience on it.
Thank you, Sonia. Appreciate you sharing. Great to hear you're in a interdisciplinary centre. Piers, did you have a comment?
Yeah, it's a little bit of firstly, yeah, it's challenging, and I think one of the other downsides is if you, as a researcher that's traditionally not been associated with an institution specific, it costs you have to add in your costs to access certain paper resources and journals, but also for me, when I, as a more of a data scientist, access to data sources, you've got to get way more data sources because it's all siloed. And you've got to pay for those and you've got to budget for those. So the vast majority of a lot of my research grant proposals are related to just the fact that it's interdisciplinary. So you have to pay for four versions of effectively the same access, but different types of data that you need. And then the second aspect, I think, is something that I've found anecdotally, and I'd love to get funding to do a full investigation, but I'd love to get other people's thoughts on that because it's siloed. I get incredibly frustrated at the piecemeal part of the journey that everything looks at. So you'll have the computer side of the specialty being about designing the software or designing the tool. And then you'll have it ever so slightly move into another bit of research that will be maybe a little bit with sociology or psychology into, how do people use and interact with the tool? And then you'll have another silo where it is about how do users apply the tool in their real life? And then later on, you'll have it out pedagogically based in terms of educational applications so that you don't get it's really, really difficult to get a full picture of either a certain piece of technology or the actual user lifestyle of a tool because it's all siloed into piecemeal parts of an overall process. Assistive technology is a very vast aspect of from conception all the way to implementation to use, redevelopment. Yeah, every paper I've looked at is very specifically looking at a stage. We don't really have that longitudinal aspect because of the silos. And as you say, trying to get research into doing the longitudinal bits or the more wider scope bits is so cross-disciplinary or interdisciplinary that you end up not being funded because it's not piecemeal. So it's like the system itself is, my personal experience, in a negative feedback cycle of you can only get funded if you research silos. So you research a silo, which then means that further research has to research a silo, if that makes sense. Which is why I'm really excited for the Assistive Technology Research Network. But I'd love other people's thoughts on have they encountered something similar, or am I just going loopy having read too many papers?
Well, it can
Probably
be
the latter.
difficult. Having done a few lit reviews now, it can be quite difficult to get access to stuff, and that's even if you know where to look. So I think that's a common problem. I just want to finish on a final thought about research prioritization, and this kind of loops back around to what Piers said earlier about finding it easier to get government research published. So the last big piece of work that I was involved in that was published earlier this year was developing a competency framework for effective assistive technology training that was commissioned by the DFE, so the Department for Education. And in designing our own research, we've aimed to develop projects that are intended to support evidence-based policymaking in AT and adjacent areas. So many of the project ideas that we have been informed by what our EduAT students are finding difficult. So recent work that we've done has included that DFE project, developing a competency framework for effective AT training. What I'd really like to do is discuss with the group AT research prioritisation. So I'm really asking, and this is a big question, what AT research do the people present think is important and why?
I mean, it's difficult to get the ethical approval, but like it's really difficult to know which tools are actually useful and which are just superfluous shovelware. Obviously, we have anecdotal-based evidence, and qualitative research into user experiences within certain tools. But given the sort of, for example, DSA has currently just done a recce of software that they've looked at. And the evidence that they've used is what's on the manufacturer's website, like not an evidence-based process, because PR bullshit, part of my language, is not a robust source of information about what particular tools, in particular assistive technology in terms of software, can actually do. So for me, I think being able to get more concrete, not discrete groups, but more concrete insight into where is a tool useful and where is it not useful, um, so that decisions can be made based on evidence rather than hoping that you've picked the right tool for the right person based on your personal experience, because it's one of the bits that we've had with the training of newer people in the field is unless they have the direct lived experience of working with students or working with disabled people, uh, they don't really know what tools good to recommend in terms of assessment stuff. And then when you try and give them information, you have to be really careful not to defame any of the software providers because they will not be happy with that. So you have to sort of edge around it and go, well, in this specific case study, you're going to do it like that. And I'd rather give them research papers that go, mind mapping software is useful in these sorts of situations, and this is really useful in these sorts of situations. Sorry, it was a part rant, part answer.
Well, I think you were getting a lot of support in your in what you were saying there. Lots of people were using the clapping.
I mean, I think the issue at the moment is, I don't know if you saw, Microsoft have released this AI training for disabled people. Have you seen that? I went and did the course. Robin Christopherson and Michael Vimish sort of headed it up, but they've got disabled staff from Microsoft talking about how they use Microsoft technology mainly, and uh, they're really pushing the AI area in, and Meta are doing it with their Ray-Ban glasses for blind, and so there is a huge push at the moment. It's a very dangerous push that AI will solve all the problems, and standard AI, Microsoft Copilot can read PDFs, and I think that's one of the real dangers at the moment.
I can see Stephen's got his hand up, so should we bring Stephen in? But if I can just say, I've posted in the chat that an article that we wrote about how our process of learning from our students, what they were finding difficult, has informed our research agenda. And the first link in there is an author accepted manuscript. So looping back round to the open access discussion we had earlier. Stephen, please.
I'll have a look at your article you've posted there. My contribution to your question about relevant areas for research. As a practitioner, I tend to work with certain students in certain learning environments, and we come up against problems, and then we design solutions, and we work with different departments and collaborate to roll that out, and it kind of takes on a project, and then look to expand on that in terms of research and where that sits in kind of a wider environment. So I mean, what Piers was saying, I very much, agree with. There's loads of areas for and Sonia as well, exploring how well actually assistive technology works and whether it does work, and whether the truth, whether the marketing holds up to scrutiny. But from my perspective, if you can work with some students, in higher education especially, where students come and go quite quickly, and trying to get students that you can actually work with and contribute, and who are willing to give their time, and put the head above the parapet a little bit, and work with you and maybe speak to the schools, is really is relatively rare and quite valuable, and you kind of got to grab it with both hands when and where you can. So it's almost being opportunistic about what you're working on, and how you can actually contribute to existing research based on the evidence that you can generate at the time. So that's how I perceive it, coming as a practitioner first, and not a researcher first, if that's helpful.
Thank you, Stephen. Appreciate everybody sharing their thoughts on these three questions I've asked. Kelly, it's 2:15. Do you think it's time to?
Sure is, yeah. Thank you so much for our great speakers and our great participants as well. I think actually it was a really rich conversation. I feel like personally I really enjoyed all the chat. And I think it's a conversation we need to keep going, like whether it's in the Assistive Technology Network or one of the many other activities. Rowan, I know you're involved a lot in connecting AT researchers, and you're an active part of the AT network as well. So thank you so much, everybody, and a well-earned break for all of us. I feel we've worked hard. So thank you so much, and yeah, catch you all later. Have a great Christmas break.
Thanks, Kelly. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.